Stand at the edge of the ravine in Rosedale, Toronto, and look north. The trees are old here. The ground drops away into a valley, carved by glacial runoff 10,000 years ago. The path winds through maples and ash, and in autumn, the light falls through them in long gold panels that move slowly across the earth as the morning passes. In 1961, the Ontario government demolished the most expensive mansion the province had ever constructed. A 60-foot limestone tower visible from across the city, a ballroom where royalty danced, a conservatory with glass walls and orchids from 3 continents, a library with carved oak bookcases and shelves that had held the private correspondence of 4 lieutenant governors of the crown. They demolished it in 10 days. They left no plaque. But this story does not begin in 1961. It begins in 1911, when the province of Ontario hired an architect, approved a budget, and instructed him to build the finest government house in the Dominion, a palace for the representative of the crown, a building magnificent enough to announce that Ontario had arrived, at civilization, at consequence, at a kind of permanence it would not be able to keep. The man who commissioned it would be dead before a single room was finished. Ontario would pour more than twice the approved budget into its walls. And the men and women who eventually lived there, worked there, and were treated there would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what the building had taken from them. If you find yourself drawn to the histories that official records prefer to leave unread, you're welcome to subscribe and come with me. To understand what Chorley Park was built to be, you have to understand what Ontario was in 1911. It was the gravitational center of a young federation still figuring out what Canadian meant. The Dominion had existed for 44 years. The population of Toronto had tripled in a single generation, from 86,000 in 1881 to nearly 380,000 by 1911. The Grand Trunk Railway had its major terminus there. The financial district along King Street was beginning to look like something that belonged in London or New York. Stone fronts, bronze doors, men in frock coats moving between buildings that spoke nothing but capital. Above all of it, in the ravined neighborhood of Rosedale, lived the people who had made that capital and intended to keep it. The addresses in Rosedale in 1911 were a precise map of Ontario's power structure. There was a correct family, a correct pew, a correct club, a correct way to receive the Governor General when he came through the city, and a correct kind of building in which to do the receiving. The Lieutenant Governor of Ontario occupied a peculiar position within this world. He was not elected. He was appointed by the federal government on the advice of the Prime Minister. He represented the Crown, which meant he held, in theory, the authority to dismiss the provincial legislature, to refuse royal assent to legislation, to summon and prorogue Parliament at his discretion. He was the embodiment of imperial authority on Ontario soil, dressed in a blue coat and a cocked hat, standing between the elected government and the monarchy that theoretically governed it. And the house he lived in was supposed to reflect that authority with exactness. In 1911, Ontario's government house was a brownstone on King Street that everyone in the political class agreed was inadequate. It was cramped. It had no proper ballroom. When the Governor General visited Toronto, the Lieutenant Governor had no room to host him without embarrassment. When royalty came through, and royalty did come through, there was nowhere to put them that didn't feel slightly colonial in the wrong way. The political class of Ontario agreed something had to be done. Ontario needed a government house commensurate with its ambitions. Something that announced, in limestone and glass and carven oak, that this province was a place of civilization, of permanence, of consequence. The consequences of that decision would take 50 years to fully arrive. The men who approved the budget had no idea what kind of building they were actually commissioning. James Pliny Whitney was born in 1843 in the township of Williamsburg in eastern Ontario. His father was a farmer. His grandfather had been a United Empire loyalist who came north after the American Revolution with nothing more than the clothes on his back and a commitment to the British crown. Whitney studied law in his 20s, was called to the bar in 1876, and began the patient, methodical climb that defined Ontario conservative politics in that era. You showed up, you ran, you lost, you showed up again. He lost his first election in 1886. He ran again in 1888 and won. He ran in 1890, 1894, 1898, and 1902, winning each time, building the kind of institutional loyalty in his riding that comes not from charisma, but from the simple fact of 30 years of showing up in the same county. In 1905, he became Premier of Ontario. What followed was not a revolution. Whitney was a builder, not a visionary, a man who believed in institutions more deeply than ideas. He expanded the University of Toronto. He established Ontario Hydro, removing electrical power from private monopoly and placing it in public hands. He reformed the province's assessment system and modernized its bureaucratic structure. He moved with deliberate speed, trusted his advisors, and did not make speeches he couldn't back up with legislation. He was, by 1911, one of the most respected political figures in the Dominion. He was also 68 years old, had been Premier for 6 years, and was beginning to feel it. He had a heart condition his doctors knew about, and his cabinet did not. And he had just approved the construction of the most expensive building the province had ever attempted. The original estimate for a new government house on Crescent Road in Rosedale was $300,000. Francis Riley Heeks, the province of Ontario's chief architect, a man who had held the position for 11 years and did not think small, submitted plans in the summer of 1911 that Whitney approved without significant modification. The site was chosen, 3.5 acres of ravine-adjacent land at the top of Crescent Road, above the Don Valley, with a view across the city that on a clear day reached the lake. Construction began in the autumn of 1911, and then the costs began to move. By 1912, the estimate had risen to $400,000. By 1913, it had passed $500,000. When members of the provincial legislature began asking questions in committee, in budget debates, in written correspondence to the Minister of Public Works, the answers were carefully evasive. The project was complex. The site presented unexpected challenges. The quality of workmanship being applied was of the highest possible standard, and that standard could not be compromised. By the spring of 1914, with the building still unfinished, the true cost had become difficult to conceal. The final construction expenditure would reach approximately $668,000, more than double the original approved amount. The furnishings and fittings brought the total toward $800,000. Ontario had commissioned a $300,000 building and was going to receive a building that cost nearly 3 times that, whether it had intended to or not. Whitney stood behind it publicly. He had no choice. The decision had been his. The approvals had come from his government. Every alternative, admission of failure, cancellation of the project, public inquiry into the cost overruns, was more politically expensive than the building itself. He was 69 years old, working 60-hour weeks, and defending in committee and in the press a building that had consumed nearly $800,000 at a moment, when the average working family in Toronto earned $600 a year. On September 25, 1914, James Pliny, Whitney died in office. He was in Toronto when it happened. His heart had been failing for months, and that morning it simply stopped. He was 71 years old. His body lay in state at the Ontario legislature for 2 days, and thousands of people filed past. The building he had commissioned, the building whose costs had consumed the final years of his political life, whose overruns he had defended in every session of the legislature since 1912, was still under construction. Not a single room was complete. He never stood inside it. He never saw what Ontario had built in his name. He was never held accountable for the cost overruns, because there was no one left to hold. Heeks drew on the English Renaissance revival tradition, the same architectural vocabulary that had given Britain its grandest country houses, and adapted it to the ravine landscape of Rosedale with a specificity that suggested both ambition and genuine craft. Every element of the exterior was calibrated to announce authority without shouting it. The approach from Crescent Road was deliberately staged. The drive curved through formal gardens, laid out with bilateral symmetry, rose beds and clipped hedges that in summer turned the approach into something from a landscape painting. The front facade presented itself in sequence. The low wings first, extending to either side, then the central block rising, and above everything, the tower. The tower was the building's signature. 60 feet of Ontario limestone, it was visible from significant distances across the city. From the waterfront, from the hills of Davenport, from the elevated platforms of Union Station. Heeks placed windows at its crown designed to be lit at night, turning the structure into a beacon. There was nowhere in much of Toronto from which you could see Chorley Park without knowing precisely what you were looking at. It had the quality of things designed to remind you they exist. Inside, the entrance hall was proportioned to make visitors feel observed. The ceiling rose to roughly 25 feet, and the floor was laid in alternating black and white marble, a pattern that drew the eye immediately forward toward the grand staircase. The staircase itself was carved in Ontario oak, its balustrade rising in a practiced curve toward the vice-regal apartments on the upper floor. The state dining room occupied the east wing. It seated 60 at a formal dinner, with standing space for a service staff of 8. The walls were hung with silk damask in deep gold that caught the candlelight from a chandelier manufactured in Birmingham, packed in 17 crates and assembled over 3 weeks by a craftsman brought in specifically for the purpose. The ballroom was larger than anything Ontario's government house had previously possessed. Parquet floors, French doors opening onto a garden terrace, a ceiling height that gave the room an acoustic quality that surprised guests who had not expected to hear each note so clearly. It was designed to hold 400 in the configuration used for state occasions. In quieter evenings, when the Hendrys used only a quarter of the space, the empty 3/4 held an echo that made the room feel as though it were waiting. The library occupied a corner of the ground floor, with south-facing windows that flooded it with afternoon light. The bookcases were built floor to ceiling in quartered oak, with carved panels depicting Ontario's emblems: the moose, the beaver, the trillium, running in a continuous frieze around all 4 walls. And there was the conservatory, a glass-walled room extending from the building's west face, built to allow the cultivation of plants that would not survive at an Ontario winter. Orchids arrived from suppliers in London and New York. In February, when the city outside was iron gray and frozen to the bone, the conservatory was green and flowering. Visitors were brought there, specifically, as a kind of controlled miracle. The building was given the name Chorley Park, after Chorley, in Lancashire, England, an ancestral association chosen for resonance, for the suggestion of roots, stretching backward across centuries into English soil. It was a name chosen for permanence. And the library, with its carved oak panels and its south-facing afternoon light, built as a room entirely for the life of the mind, would one day hold the metal frame cots of men who could no longer trust their own minds to tell them where they were. Chorley Park received its first official residence in April of 1915. Lieutenant Governor Sir John Strathern Hendry was 62 years old, a Hamilton businessman, a militia veteran, and a conservative of unimpeachable establishment credentials. He had been appointed in 1914 by Prime Minister Robert Borden, and when he moved into the completed mansion with his household staff in the spring of 1915, he became the first person to occupy the building that Whitney had commissioned and died without seeing. He moved in during the week following the Second Battle of Ypres. Between April 22nd and May 25th of 1915, Canadian forces had faced the first large-scale use of chlorine gas in the history of modern warfare. More than 6,000 Canadians were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in that engagement alone. The casualty lists were still running in the newspapers, in columns that went on for full pages, when Hendry's furniture was carried through the front doors on Crescent Road. Ontario knew this. The newspapers were full of it. The breadth of the losses was still being understood. Chorley Park opened anyway. What followed was what government houses do. The round of official ceremony that is the vice-regal calendar. Garden parties in June, when the rose beds were at their peak. Investitures in the formal dining room. The arrival of delegations, military attachés, visiting dignitaries from the colonies, the Dominion, and eventually the United States. The Lieutenant Governor's levee on New Year's Day, when every member of the Toronto establishment came through the front door in order of social precedence and shook Henry's hand. In the summer of 1917, the Duke of Devonshire, then Governor-General of Canada, visited Toronto and was received at Chorley Park. The state dining room was set for 60. The ballroom was opened for the evening reception. From the ravine below, passers-by who were not invited, who could not have been invited, who belonged to a different Ontario entirely, could see the light moving through the upper stories as the functions continued well past midnight. Henry's term ended in 1919. His successors, Lionel Clark, Henry Cockshut, William Ross MacDonald, Herbert Alexander Bruce, each inherited the building, the calendar, the staff, the rose gardens, and the increasingly uneasy sense that the world for which Chorley Park had been designed was accelerating away from them. The 1920s arrived. The automobile changed Toronto's social geography. The radio made the careful management of public narrative suddenly impossible in ways the political class had not anticipated. And the labor movement, which had always pressed against the walls of the world that Chorley Park represented, was gaining coherent political form that made the vice-regal calendar look not merely ceremonial, but, at certain angles, slightly absurd. Through all of it, Chorley Park continued. Garden parties, investitures, the levee, the correct guests in the correct sequence in the correct rooms, the tower lit against the Toronto night. By 1932, the unemployment rate in Ontario had reached 27%. Men who had spent their working lives in stable trades found themselves in bread lines that stretched around city blocks in every major Ontario city. Families in Rosedale kept their servants and their gardens. The Scott Mission on Shooter Street in Toronto served 3,000 meals a day. There was no formal social safety net. There was no unemployment insurance. There was charity, which ran out. And there was nothing. At 150 Crescent Road, the household staff at Chorley Park continued to polish the marble entry floor, tend the rose beds, maintain the conservatory orchids, and prepare the state dining room for functions to which no one in the breadline would ever be invited. The contrast was not invisible. It was not subtle. The Toronto Daily Star and other newspapers had begun asking whether the expense of maintaining a full vice-regal household, estimated at $85,000 a year in public money, made sense in a province where children were going hungry in ways that had not been seen in living memory. Into this political climate, in June of 1934, walked Mitchell Frederick Hepburn. Hepburn was 37 years old, an onion farmer from Elgin County, and a liberal with a talent for political theater that bordered on genius. He had a voice like a revival preacher, and an instinct for the angers of ordinary people that he deployed with something approaching scientific precision. He won the Ontario election in a landslide, ending a conservative dynasty that had governed the province for most of the previous decade. Within months of taking office, Hepburn had sold the government's fleet of limousines at public auction. He had reduced cabinet ministers' salaries. He had moved through the public budget with a theatrical brutality that made front pages across the Dominion. On September 8, 1937, Mitchell Hepburn closed Chorley Park. He did not announce it in advance. There was no heritage review. There was no consultation with the sitting Lieutenant Governor, Herbert Alexander Bruce, whose household staff were given notice by letter. The announcement came through the press, with Hepburn telling reporters that Chorley Park was an unnecessary extravagance, a monument to the financial recklessness of the governments that had preceded him, and that Ontario could not justify maintaining a palace for one man at the cost of the people. The Lieutenant Governor was moved to a suite of rooms at the King Edward Hotel. The household staff, the butler, the cook, the groundskeepers, the maintenance workers, some of whom had built their entire working lives around the assumption that Ontario's government house would continue as long as Ontario did, were given notice. The rose beds were not maintained through the winter of 1937 to 1938. By spring, they were already returning to wildness. The conservatory orchids, without care, died within weeks. The marble floors of the entrance hall collected the particular cold of unheated stone in the Canadian winter. And the tower windows, which had been lit for parties, investitures, royal visits, and the ordinary ceremonies of a functioning vice-regal household for 22 years, went dark. They would not be lit again. The men who would arrive next had not been invited. They had simply run out of anywhere else to go. In September of 1939, Canada declared war on Germany. Within months, the scale of what was needed, in terms of convalescent facilities, rehabilitation beds, and places where men coming back from training accidents or from the specific psychological collapse the military had not yet formally agreed to call a medical condition could be housed and observed, began pressing against the limits of what the country's existing infrastructure could provide. In 1940, Chorley Park was converted to military use. The transformation was not gentle. The state dining room was cleared of its furniture, its silk damask stripped from the walls, its floor divided into wards with metal frame cots arranged in rows. The ballroom, which had held 400 guests during state occasions, became the primary receiving ward. Its parquet floor was covered in linoleum. Its chandelier was removed to storage and replaced by a grid of industrial fluorescent lighting that turned the room a constant flat white, regardless of the hour. The conservatory's glass panes were painted over for blackout compliance. The formal gardens were given over to vegetable production. Only two elements survived the conversion intact: the marble entrance hall floor, which proved impossible to cover without damaging it permanently, and the carved oak bookcases of the library, which were pushed against the walls and hidden behind hospital-grade partitions, but not destroyed. The building became Chorley Park Military Hospital. Men arrived. They came from training bases in southern Ontario. They came from England. Some came directly from overseas postings, where a sustained artillery bombardment, a weeks-long advance through winter mud, a position that could not be relieved, had done something to them that no one had a precise clinical word for yet. They came in the uniforms they'd left in. They came carrying almost nothing. They came through the front doors beneath the 60-foot tower, across the marble entry floor, and into wards that smelled of carbolic soap and institutional cooking. Not one of them had been told what they might face inside. The medical direction of Canadian military psychiatric services during the Second World War fell to a network of clinicians who believed, with genuine conviction, that the psychiatric casualties of modern warfare were treatable, and who were simultaneously under enormous institutional pressure to treat them quickly and return as many men as possible to duty. The physicians assigned to facilities like Chorley Park held genuine credentials. They had trained at British and Canadian medical schools. They had contributed to the psychiatric literature on neurosis, trauma, and anxiety states. They had held positions in civilian hospitals that commanded respect. They arrived at Chorley Park as professionals who believed in what they were doing. Their approach to what the military formally called war neurosis, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, was shaped by two imperatives that no one in the institutional structure had fully acknowledged were in conflict. The first was therapeutic. These men were suffering, and suffering was a medical problem that medicine existed to solve. The second was operational. These men were needed, and military need did not wait for the completion of ideal therapeutic timelines. The treatments available to military psychiatrists in 1940s Canada were the treatments of their era, not the treatments of ours. They were applied with confidence derived from the medical literature of their time. They were applied to men who had not consented to them in any meaningful sense, because the military's authority over a soldier's body was, in that era, essentially absolute. A soldier who refused prescribed treatment could be classified as refusing duty. The consequences of refusing duty during wartime were significant enough that the distinction between consent and compliance became theoretical. The treatments were documented. The clinical records were filed. Some of those records exist in the archives of Ontario and Library and Archives Canada today. Others do not. In April of 1917, the British military's formal investigation into shell shock from the First World War had concluded that the condition was real, that it was not cowardice, and that its treatment required a range of approaches: removal from the conditions that had caused it, rest, and careful psychological support. By 1940, the Canadian military's approach to what was now called war neurosis had absorbed some of those conclusions. What it had absorbed, the recognition that psychiatric casualties were real medical cases, not disciplinary failures. What it had not absorbed, the understanding that returning men to the institutional conditions that had broken them, the hierarchy, the pressure, the requirement to perform stability they did not possess, would frequently break them again. The institutional pressure inside Chorley Park Military Hospital, as at every comparable Canadian facility in that period, was toward rapid treatment and discharge. A man stabilized in 6 weeks was preferred to a man who needed 6 months. A man who could return to light duty was preferable to one who could not return at all. The therapeutic goal and the operational goal were in constant, quiet conflict, and the operational goal had an institutional weight behind it that therapeutic concern alone could not match. 3 primary treatment modalities were applied at Chorley Park during the war years: narcosis therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, and pharmacologically facilitated abreaction. The reasoning behind each was internally coherent within the medical knowledge of 1940. The results were not always what the reasoning predicted. The military had determined in 1917 that returning broken men to the conditions that had broken them would break them again. In 1943, it was doing precisely that, and calling the process treatment. Narcosis therapy, the administration of barbiturates to induce sustained deep sleep, sometimes for days at a time, was applied to patients at Chorley Park on the basis of a theory that the exhausted nervous system needed radical rest in order to recover its baseline function. A man admitted with severe war neurosis would be given sodium amytal or similar compounds and maintained in a state of semi-consciousness for periods ranging from several days to, in documented cases at comparable facilities, more than 3 weeks. He would be woken briefly for feeding and for the administration of further medication. He was not woken for conversation. He was not woken to be told where he was or what was being done to him. When the narcosis ended, patients frequently reported a period of significant confusion, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes lasting days, during which they were uncertain of their own names, uncertain of the year, and uncertain of the whereabouts of people they had last known before being admitted. The clinical notes of the period describe this as an expected phase of recovery. Electroconvulsive therapy had been introduced to psychiatric medicine in 1938 by the Italian physicians Ugo Terletti and Lucio Bini, and by 1942 was in routine use at military psychiatric hospitals across the Commonwealth. At Chorley Park, ECT was applied to patients with severe depression, intractable anxiety states, and cases of war neurosis that had not responded to narcosis. The procedure involved the passage of electrical current through the brain via electrodes placed at the temples, inducing a generalized seizure. Why it produced improvement, when it produced improvement, was not understood. The military physicians at Chorley Park knew what the literature told them, that in a significant proportion of cases, ECT produced measurable improvement in depressive symptoms, that the improvements could be dramatic, and that the primary side effects, memory loss, disorientation, and sustained headaches, were described in that literature as temporary. They were not always temporary. One pattern documented in the post-war medical literature for the period, though specific Chorley Park patient records remain split across multiple archives, some restricted, some simply missing, describes patients who received multiple courses of ECT over several months, returning from treatment, able to perform basic daily functions, but unable to recall significant portions of their lives before admission. They knew their names. They could dress themselves and eat. They could answer questions about the present. They could not remember their weddings. They could not remember the births of their children. They could not retrieve the emotional context that had made their lives their own. One documented description from the broader literature of the period, written by a veteran of a comparable facility, describes this experience as looking at a photograph of a stranger. The biographical details are present. The interior of the person is not. Abreaction, the third primary modality, was practiced using intravenous injections of sodium amytal or pentothal under the theory that traumatic memory could be accessed and therapeutically processed if the patient's conscious defensive resistance was pharmacologically reduced. In practice, the sessions sometimes produced what the clinical notes recorded as release and improvement. In other cases, patients reported that the procedure had done nothing except make the traumatic memory more vivid, more insistent, and more impossible to leave behind than it had been before admission. There was no formal protocol for the cases in which abreaction made things worse. The clinical note would record patient remained symptomatic, and the treatment plan would be reassessed. The assessments were made by men with good intentions and inadequate tools. The consequences were borne by men who had already given everything they had. Behind every treatment notation is a name. Some of those names can still be found. Numbers, even disturbing ones, can become abstract. So let us remember three names. Private Walter Szymanski was 24 years old in the summer of 1943, the son of Polish immigrants who had settled in Oshawa in 1928. His father worked at the General Motors plant on Kendallwood Road. Walter had enlisted in September of 1939, 2 weeks after the declaration of war, because he believed in what the war was for, and because the enlistment pay was $1.25 a day at a moment when the plant was laying men off. He was assigned to the Royal Canadian Regiment and served in the Italian campaign. He came back from a position outside Ortona in December of 1943, unable to speak, in complete sentences, unable to sleep more than 90 minutes at a stretch, and unable to be in a room with more than 3 other people without beginning to shake. He was brought to Chorley Park in January of 1944. He received 17 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy over 6 weeks. His commanding officer's report, filed on discharge in March of 1944, described him as significantly improved and noted his return to light duties. His clinical file does not indicate that he was told what ECT involved before the first session. He went back to Oshawa in October of 1945, medically discharged. His father was at the door. His mother had prepared a meal. He sat down at the table, where he had eaten breakfast every morning for the first 18 years of his life, and he could not remember the name of the street they lived on. He knew the faces of the people around him. He could not access what those faces had meant. He worked as a night watchman for 11 years, a job that required no sustained interaction, that could be done alone, in the dark, without needing to remember anything. He died in 1971. He never filed a complaint. He never wrote a letter. He did not know that it was possible to do so, and no one from the institution that had treated him ever suggested it. Sergeant Raymond Forder was 31 years old in the autumn of 1942. He had been a mathematics teacher at the Lindsay Collegiate Institute in Lindsay, Ontario, teaching grades 9 and 10. He had a wife named Edna and a daughter named Carol, who was 4 years old when he left for England. He came back from Dieppe. He came back from Dieppe with 43 men from his unit. 207 had gone in. He did not speak about what had occurred in those 9 hours on the beach. Not to Edna in the letters he was permitted to write, not to the army chaplain who made rounds, not to the officers who conducted the formal debrief. He was admitted to Chorley Park in November of 1942, after he was found by a fellow officer sitting against the wall of his barracks at 3 in the morning, fully dressed, unable to say where he thought he was. He received narcosis treatment and abreaction sessions that the clinical notes describe as producing significant emotional response. He was discharged in February of 1943, noted as adequately stabilized for administrative duties. He returned to teaching in September of 1946. His students described him, uniformly, as competent and distant. He assigned exercises with precision and marked them without error. He did not speak about the war with any of them. In 1957, he left Lindsay and moved alone to a rented room in Peterborough. He told Edna he needed somewhere quieter. Carol was 17. She wrote him letters for 2 years before she stopped. He died in 1962, 1 year after the building where he had been treated was demolished without announcement. He never knew it was gone. No one told him. No one thought to. Lieutenant Dorothy Marguerite Hale was 29 years old and a nursing sister in the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps when she was admitted to Chorley Park in the spring of 1944 as a patient rather than as staff. She had served in England and in Italy. She had administered emergency care under conditions that the Medical Corps training had not fully prepared her for, in circumstances for which the Medical Corps culture provided no language of acknowledgement. When she reported to her commanding medical officer that she was experiencing intrusive recurring thoughts and a sustained inability to sleep, she was told that nursing sisters were expected to maintain composure and that she should consider whether her symptoms might be related to shift fatigue. She persisted. She was referred. She came to Chorley Park. She received the same narcosis protocol applied to the male patients in the adjacent ward. Her primary clinical diagnosis was recorded as anxiety state with hysterical features. She was 29 years old. She had served in 2 active theaters of war. She had personally administered care to men dying from phosphorus burns. Hysterical features. She recovered. She returned to nursing after the war, working first at the Toronto General Hospital and then, from 1951, at the Hospital for Sick Children. She was formally decorated for her wartime service in 1947. She told no one what had been in her clinical notes until 1989, when she gave a single interview to a journalist researching the wartime treatment of female medical personnel. She said, "They gave me a word that meant they hadn't listened to me, and then they gave me drugs until the word fit." She died in 1994 at the age of 79. Chorley Park had been a pile of rubble for 33 years. These 3 accounts represent dozens more, perhaps hundreds, whose records are incomplete, restricted, or simply gone. Many veterans of Chorley Park Military Hospital never came forward after the war. Some carried the stigma of psychiatric treatment in a culture that did not separate mental illness from moral failure. Some were too damaged by what had happened to navigate the bureaucratic channels that might have acknowledged it. Some died before anyone with the authority to investigate chose to ask. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their treatment deserves to be examined. Ontario, as of today, has done neither. In 1959, the Ontario government's Department of Public Works completed a structural assessment of Chorley Park. The building was sound. The tower was sound. The roof required significant repair. The electrical system needed full upgrading. The estimated cost to restore Chorley Park to functional operational use was approximately $350,000, roughly half of what it had cost to build, in period equivalent dollars, substantially less than that. The building had documented potential alternative uses: provincial offices, an institutional facility, a conference center, possibly a cultural institution of some kind. Comparable buildings in Ontario had been successfully repurposed during the same period. The government chose demolition. The decision was not taken to public committee. It was not debated in the legislature. The Minister of Public Works, under Premier Leslie Frost's government, directed the department to proceed. A demolition contractor was engaged. The contract specified a completion timeline. No inventory was made of the building's surviving interior elements. The carved oak bookcases of the library, which had survived the military conversion, which had stood through 2 decades of neglect and operational use, were destroyed. The clinical records from the military hospital period, the administrative correspondence from the vice-regal period, the photographic record of what the interior had contained. The disposition of these materials was not publicly accounted for. Some are in provincial archives, partially, under access restrictions that vary in ways not easily navigated by civilian researchers or by the families of people who were treated there. Others have not been located. The veterans who had been treated at Chorley Park, the Walter Szymanskis, the Raymond Forders, the Dorothy Hales, were not notified that the building was being demolished. There was no legal obligation to notify them. The province had never formally acknowledged that Chorley Park had been used as a psychiatric hospital for military personnel, or that the treatments applied within its walls had, in documented cases, produced lasting harm. The men who made the demolition decision were never questioned about it. No one asked them, in any formal proceeding, to account for what was chosen to be destroyed. Not one of them faced any consequence. The truth about Chorley Park has surfaced in pieces over decades, in ways that have never quite added up to a reckoning. The Ontario Archives holds fragments, administrative records, partial construction documents, a handful of photographs from the vice-regal period showing the exterior in its original state. The clinical records from the military hospital period are split between the Provincial Archives, Library and Archives Canada, and the Department of National Defence, whose access restrictions on certain categories of wartime medical records have remained in place in various forms since the 1940s. In the 1970s, veterans advocacy groups in Ontario began compiling informal accounts from men who had been treated at military hospitals during the war, including Chorley Park. The accounts were consistent in their outlines. The treatments described the absence of meaningful prior consent, the discharge without follow-up, the lasting effects that had never been acknowledged by any institution. The group sent formal letters to provincial and federal offices. They received polite responses, noting that military medical records of the period were subject to privacy provisions, and that general inquiries could be directed to the appropriate departmental archive. The letters continued. The responses remained polite. Academic researchers who accessed the partial record during the 1980s and 1990s documented the cost overruns, the vice-regal history, the World War II conversion, and the demolition decision in publications that circulated within heritage preservation and military history circles. None of this entered the public record in any form that produced legislative action or institutional acknowledgement. The Chorley Park site received some heritage recognition as a landscape. The Ravine Park and its geological significance noted in city planning documents. The built history of what had stood on that ground is not the subject of that recognition. In the decades since, Library and Archives Canada has released partial tranches of wartime medical records. The releases have been incomplete. Researchers who have worked with the released material have noted in academic publications that the records from Chorley Park Military Hospital are among the least complete of any comparable Ontario facility from the same operational period. Whether that incompleteness is the result of deliberate management, administrative accident, or the ordinary entropy of institutional record-keeping over 80 years remains an open question. It is an open question to which no official body has yet directed any formal inquiry. The veterans who were treated there are now, almost universally, dead. The officials who made the demolition decision are dead. The political figures who approved those decisions are dead. The province waited, and the waiting worked. Chorley Park was not the last building Ontario razed to represent something it had not yet decided to account for. The logic that produced Chorley Park, commission it grandly, use it carelessly, erase it quietly, wait until those inside it are no longer alive to object, reappears across Ontario's institutional history with a consistency that suggests not accident, but habit. Kingston Penitentiary, constructed in 1835 on the architectural theory that a sufficiently austere environment could reform the criminal character, subjected its inmates to documented punishments: the lash, sustained solitary confinement, the box, that were investigated, reported on, and continued. When the institution finally closed in 2013, 178 years after it opened, the official government statement described the closure as the end of an era of corrections. It did not name any specific documented harm inflicted on any specific documented person. The building became a hotel and a tourist attraction. The residential school system, operating in Ontario from the 1840s through 1996, used buildings, many of them architecturally impressive, many of them built with public money, many of them built specifically to house the children of indigenous families, as the physical instrument of a policy of cultural destruction. When the harms entered the formal public record through survivor testimony, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the subsequent discovery of unmarked graves, the institutional response distinguished between the policy, which governments acknowledged, and the individuals who had implemented that policy, whom governments declined to name. The Huronia Regional Center in Aurelia, an institution for people with intellectual disabilities that operated from 1876 to 2009, was the subject of documented abuse across decades. Former residents filed a class action lawsuit in 2010. The Ontario government settled in 2013. The settlement included a formal apology from Premier Kathleen Wynne. It also included non-disclosure agreements that legally prevented the individual plaintiffs from speaking publicly about their specific experiences. The province apologized. Then it used legal instruments to ensure that the specifics of what it was apologizing for could not be publicly known. In each case, the architecture announced authority. The institution contained people who could not easily leave. And when the institution was finally emptied, the accounting was partial, the apology was conditional, and the building was repurposed, demolished, or converted to tourism without a full record of what had occurred within. The pattern that demolished Chorley Park, without notification, without inventory, without a word to the people inside it, was not an anomaly. It was Ontario's established institutional practice. The Chorley Park site sits at the north end of Crescent Road in Rosedale, at the edge of the ravine above the Don Valley. It is a public park. The City of Toronto maintains the walking trails. In summer, dog walkers and joggers move through it in the morning light. In October, the maple canopy turns, and the light comes through it amber and unhurried. If you know where to look, you can find the remnants of the formal garden's retaining walls, low stone courses, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated vegetation, that once held the bilateral symmetry of the rose beds in place. They are the only above-ground evidence that anything stood here. There is no plaque naming what the building was. There is no plaque naming who lived there. There is no plaque naming who was treated there, what was done to them, or what they carried when they left. The provincial government that demolished Chorley Park in 1961 has not been succeeded by any government that chose to install one. The military hospital records that pertain to Chorley Park remain split across multiple archives, in some cases restricted, in some cases simply absent from existing finding aids. If you are the child or grandchild of someone who spent months inside that building during the Second World War, no provincial office offers you a consolidated resource for understanding what happened there, what was done there, or what rights, if any, you or your family might have relative to that history. The institutional silence is not passive. Silence of this duration requires maintenance. There are two Chorley Parks. The first was built in 1915 by a province that wanted to announce its own significance. It was built with public money that exceeded its approved budget by more than double, in a political process that was not transparent, by a premier who died before a single room was finished and could therefore not be held responsible by anyone but history. It celebrated something, the ambition of a young federation that believed in the permanence of its institutions and the dignity of the offices it had designed. The worst the first Chorley Park did was cost more than it should have, and house people in comfort during years when other people were dying. The second Chorley Park was a military hospital that treated hundreds of men and women broken by the Second World War using methods that, in documented cases, produced lasting neurological and psychological harm. It did this with genuine therapeutic intention and insufficient clinical knowledge, inside whose operational pressures consistently subordinated patient welfare to the goal of returning bodies to the service roles. It did this in rooms built for beauty, in a building designed for ceremony that kept none of the promises implicit in either. The province that built the first Chorley Park and operated the second one demolished both in 1961, without a legislative debate, without a heritage assessment, without notifying anyone who had lived or suffered inside, and without a public record of what was lost in the destruction. These are not two separate institutional failures, separated by decades. They are the same institutional pattern. Use a place for whatever purpose is convenient, and decline to account for what that use cost the people inside it. Ontario has never named this pattern. It has, however, demonstrated it with some consistency. Some questions cannot be answered because the records were never kept. Some cannot be answered because the records were kept and then lost. Some cannot be answered because the records exist in archives where access restrictions have not been resolved. And some cannot be answered because no one with the authority to investigate has yet chosen to ask them formally. How many patients were treated at Chorley Park Military Hospital between 1940 and the building's post-war decommissioning? The number in the surviving records is not complete. How many of those patients experienced lasting harm from the treatments they received? Harm that affected their capacity to work, to parent, to hold a marriage together, to remain present inside their own lives. No study has been commissioned. How many of them understood, before the first session of electroconvulsive therapy or narcosis, that those treatments carried significant risks to memory and personality function? No systematic review of the consent practices of the period has been published relative to Chorley Park specifically. Who made the specific decision to demolish the building without heritage assessment, without patient notification, without inventory of the clinical records? The internal government correspondence that produced that decision exists in the provincial archives. Whether it has been read by any researcher in the past several decades is not documented in any finding aid currently accessible to the public. Will Ontario ever install a plaque? Will any government order a formal review of what was done to the men and women treated there, and what those treatments cost them? Will the families of Walter Szymański and Raymond Forder and Dorothy Hale ever be told where the records are? These are not rhetorical questions. They are open ones. And then there is the tower that Francis Riley Heeks placed at the center of the facade in the years of construction, 60 feet of Ontario limestone with windows at its crown designed to be seen from across the city. The tower that was lit for garden parties and royal visits and New Year's levees while Toronto watched from streets it had not been invited to cross. The tower whose light went dark on September 8, 1937, when Mitchell Hepburn turned it off and called it an extravagance. The tower that received into its shadow in 1940 the first men who came to Chorley Park not as guests, but as patients. The last thing to fall when the demolition crew finished in 1961 was the tower. There is nothing there now where it stood. The sky over Rosedale is unobstructed at that point. The ravine trees have grown up into the space where the windows used to be, and on autumn mornings, the light comes through them in the way it comes through old trees everywhere, as though it has time, as though it is not afraid of what it finds. But the view from that tower, on a clear October day, the lake to the south, the Don Valley turning gold, the city below in all its forward momentum and its careful forgetting, that view still exists. Ontario chose not to let the building keep it. That is the choice, made deliberately, by people who knew what they were choosing. And the choosing tells you everything about the province that made it.